There are moments that make you realize the world you live in can collapse in a single blink. And for me, that moment was when I opened the closet door in my son's unnervingly silent house, and a pair of small blue eyes, cracked dry with fear, stared at me from the abyssal dark as if the boy had just seen something no 9-year-old should ever have to witness. His body shaking so badly his fingers dug into the shelf edge, nails half broken, and the words he stammered about, waiting for his dad to call him out of the closet, iced my heart as if someone had set a block of frozen stone inside it. And right then I understood there were secrets in this house, things I had never been allowed to know, waiting to be dragged into the light no matter how cruel the truth might be. So if a sentence, an image, or even a held breath in this telling makes your heart catch, leave me a single. So I know that somewhere out there someone is walking this path with me, and if you want to stay with me through stories of family, justice, and the shadows people hide beneath their roofs, hit subscribe and tell me which city you're listening from, because your presence is what keeps my heart steady enough to go on. For a full week I couldn't get my son on the phone, and that morning I saw my grandson's eyes, from inside a dark closet. At 67 I thought I had already learned every strange quiet in a lifetime, but that silence on that Tuesday morning pulled me into a depth I had never imagined. For 12 years since Nathan moved out to live on his own in Dover, we had kept an unbroken ritual. Tuesday morning, 8:45. Either he called me or I called him, no notice, no reason needed, just a few words, asking how Owen was that week. Then I would return to brewing my Earl Grey, and he would go back to the construction site. And that tiny ritual, the steady rhythm of kinship, was what told me something was wrong the moment last Tuesday came. 8:45, no call. 8:50, I dialed my son, telling myself he was probably coordinating workers and couldn't hear the phone. But after 6 rings, it went to voicemail. Nathan, it's Dad. Call me when you can. And usually he called right after his meeting, but that noon, that afternoon, that whole night, nothing. Wednesday I tried again, 6:30 in the morning, his coffee hour, still voicemail, and this time there was a sound in my voice I hated hearing from myself. Worry. That evening I called his crew at the Route 16 site, and Bill, Nathan's foreman, answered. Mr. Granger? Nathan hasn't shown up since Monday. I figured he had the flu, and I stood silent for a few seconds, my hand gripping the old landline receiver until my knuckles whitened. Nathan, absent since Monday? And all that time my son hadn't called anyone. When I hung up, I knew something had slipped out of its natural orbit. In decades of teaching history, I had explained to students how small markers lead to great turning points, and now I was standing at one myself. Thursday, I called the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Hughes, who often saw Owen kicking a ball outside, her voice dropping as she mentioned Nathan's house. I haven't seen his car leave the driveway since Sunday. The lights were on that night, then off. Quiet ever since. Quiet, such a simple word, yet it weighed on me like stone. Sleep left me, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, while my mind ran through every worst-case thought. And by next Sunday morning, when I saw the cold cup of tea sitting on my kitchen table, I knew I couldn't stay still one more minute. I packed a small bag, a few clothes, blood pressure medication, car keys. Portsmouth's late winter air had that wet cold that cuts through coats, but I sat behind the wheel of my old Subaru and began the 90-minute drive, longer than any of my life. The scenery along the road, white wooden houses, mist-draped hemlocks, meant nothing, while my mind held only one question. Where is Nathan? When I turned onto the narrow road leading to my son's house, my heart clenched with each passing yard. Nathan's light brown house appeared, unnervingly still. On the porch, newspapers were stuffed into a swollen stack from the damp. Nathan hated leaving papers on the porch. Another sign. At the front door, the pine door he had installed himself eased open at my touch. Unlocked. My son locked doors even when watering the lawn. I whispered, Nathan? and the hollow echo from the empty house felt like an omen. Inside, everything was ordinary to the point of wrong. Too clean, too neat, but like a teacher trained to study every detail in historical documents. My eyes caught three small discrepancies immediately. The coffee table shifted half an inch off the rug. I'd given him that rug. I knew exactly where it sat. A glass lying on its side near the sink, as if someone had abandoned it midway, and the living room curtain pulled just slightly crooked, as if someone had stood there and hastily straightened it. The whole house felt paused mid-motion. I climbed the stairs, my palms damp, calling, "Nathan? Owen?" No answer. But at Owen's door I heard a sound, very faint, enough to freeze my spine, scratching, soft, from inside the closet. I went still, the whole world narrowing to a single thin breath, and when I reached for the closet handle, I knew my life was about to turn down a path no father ever wants to walk. I gripped the handle, the icy bite of the metal, shooting straight into my palm, then pulled the door open in a slow, suffocating motion as the hallway light spilled in and revealed a small figure curled tight among the winter coats. Owen, my grandson, the 9-year-old I could still picture darting around the schoolyard during last year's field trip, now folded in on himself like a little bird forgotten in a snowstorm, and I dropped to my knees, feeling them nearly give way when I saw the faint rise and fall of his breath, his brown hair matted to his forehead, his lips cracked dry, his thin hands clutching something, a light blue toy card, last year's birthday gift from me. "Owen, you," my voice rasped, my throat blocked without my noticing, and his lashes fluttered slowly. Then his eyes opened, clouded with exhaustion, but locking onto me as if I were the last scrap of life he could cling to. A smile flickering, paper thin, and when he tried to speak, the whisper cut straight through me. "Grandpa," I heard Mommy's voice, and I felt my blood freeze, unable to understand, unwilling to understand, knowing only that this wasn't a dreamer's murmur, but a memory, something that had truly happened in this house. I slid my hands beneath him, his body so light I nearly lost my grip. And in 67 years, I had never felt my own hands tremble like that, as I lifted him and fumbled for my phone, pressing 911 with a thumb I could hardly control. Emergency? My grandson, he's alive, but very weak, and my son is missing. I can't recall what I said or how I said it, only the dispatcher's voice telling me to stay calm, check his breathing, that the nearest ambulance was on its way. I set Owen on the living room sofa, but he clung to my shirt immediately, terrified I would vanish, so I sat beside him, holding his tiny hand in mine, so small I had to force each breath not to break down right there. When the ambulance arrived, its flashing lights slashed through the windows like knives of brightness, and 2 paramedics rushed in, firing questions, checking vitals, placing an IV, wrapping him in blankets, one murmuring just loudly enough for me to hear, "Severe dehydration, maybe multiple days," and I couldn't let myself imagine how many multiple meant. They lifted him onto the stretcher, and I walked beside them, never letting go of that small hand, not for a second. And when the ambulance doors shut, the click echoed in my head like the closing lock of a door my life was about to be dragged through. Inside, I sat close to his stretcher as he blinked halfway open, his lips moving. "Grandpa." I waited for Daddy to call, but Daddy didn't call. I was scared to come out. And I laid my hand on his forehead, the feverish heat choking me. "You're safe now, Owen. Grandpa's here. No one can hurt you anymore." And I kept holding his hand until the ambulance stopped at the gates of Boston Children's Hospital. The emergency hall was bright white, filled with footsteps, machines, voices calling out. But I saw only one thing, the stretcher rolling farther and farther from me into the automatic doors of pediatric emergency. A young doctor stepped in, took the paramedic's report, then turned to me. "Your relation to the patient?" I'm his grandfather. His father, is missing." Her face softened. She checked the preliminary readings and spoke with steady seriousness, not cold, but grave. "Mr. Granger, it's very fortunate the child survived. With this level of dehydration and exhaustion, he may have been hiding in an enclosed space for at least—" She paused, looking deeply at me, as if bracing me for the blow. "At least 6 days." My heart dropped to the cold floor. 6 days. 6 days a 9-year-old trapped in a dark closet without light, without an adult, waiting for a voice that would never call again, and I knew this was only the beginning of what waited for me on the other side. The next morning, as the pale gray Boston light filtered through the frosted glass along the pediatric hallway, a petite woman with her hair tied low and neat and a pair of thin-rimmed glasses stepped into Owen's room. She smiled, not the polite kind, but the soft, slow sort worn by people who have spent long hours sitting beside fresh pain. "You're Owen, right?" she asked, her voice slightly husky but warm. Owen nodded faintly, still holding the toy car in his hand, his eyes like a small animal, unsure whether the metal cage around him had truly been opened. "I'm Ava Mori, the psychologist here. If you want, you can call me Miss Ava." She pulled a chair close to the bed and set down a box of colored pencils and a thick stack of blank paper. I stood in the corner, beside the foldable chair where I had dozed off through the night, my hand still around a cup of cold paper coffee. As a history teacher, I'd watched generations of students struggle to speak about what haunted them, and I understood instantly what Ava was doing. When words are too heavy, you let drawings carry them. "Can you help me draw your bedroom? The one with the closet?" she asked, placing a sheet of paper on the hospital tray. Owen glanced at me as if asking silently, and when I nodded, he carefully set the car beside his pillow and picked up a pencil. His thin hands slowly traced the first lines: a square for the window, a rectangle for the bed, then a large box in the corner, the closet shaded darker than anything else, as if it were the main character in that room. Ava didn't interrupt, only asking short, open questions now and then. "That night, Owen, when you hid in here, what was it like outside?" Owen's pencil paused. Then he added diagonal streaks outside the window. "Rain, a lot, and wind." His voice was small, but the answer held no hesitation, the memory still painfully fresh. "Where were you at the start?" Ava asked, her tone light, as though asking about a movie night. "I was building a Lego city on the rug." The pencil drifted downward, sketching a jumble of squares and rectangles. "And then what happened, Owen?" The boy swallowed, gripping the pencil tighter. "The doorbell rang, a bunch of times. Ding-dong, ding-dong, ding-dong." He drew small circles layered over one another, like a sound that wouldn't stop. A chill crawled up my spine. Ava nodded gently, never pushing. "What did Daddy say to you?" Owen switched to a black pencil and darkened the closet in the corner of the page. Daddy looked at me. His face was really scared. He said, "Owen, get in the closet. Don't come out until Daddy calls." He lowered the pencil for a moment, as if that sentence alone was too heavy for him to keep drawing. I had to look out the window because my eyes suddenly burned. I pictured my son, Nathan, his calloused construction worker hands sweeping his child's toys aside to open the closet, his deep voice tight with urgency as he told his son to hide. He'd always put Owen's safety above everything. "And what did you hear next?" Ava asked, still soft, slower now as though stepping onto thin glass. Owen drew 2 stick figures outside the room near the door. When Ava asked who they were, he answered very quietly but clearly, "Mommy, and a man." His voice low, strange. I didn't know him. A red pencil appeared. This time the lines weren't neat. The strokes turned hard, sharp, almost like claw marks across the page. "Mommy yelled at Daddy about money." Owen began speaking faster, as if once the door of memory had cracked open, the flood behind it couldn't be held back. "She said Daddy owed a lot. Daddy said he already helped. He couldn't anymore. The man said Daddy was selfish, said Daddy was hiding money from Mommy. I heard the word money, and it felt like someone was hammering nails into my temples. Money. It is always money in the stories that should have been made only of family. What words did you hear exactly? Ava asked, absently twirling her pen. Owen frowned, trying to recall. Mommy said, 37,000. You threw it away. And you still say, no. And she talked about something called crypto. I don't know what that is. I did. Enough to make my whole body go cold. 37,000 crypto? I remembered Nathan mentioning over the phone that Melanie, his ex-wife, was trying an investment thing with some new guy, and her account evaporated by an amount nearly equal to my entire annual teacher's salary. I told him then, don't be foolish enough to pay it all for her. Debt from chasing quick profit has to be carried by the one who chased it. Nathan just laughed and said, I'm only trying to keep Owen from hearing them fight, Dad. Yet now those arguments had burst past the walls of his house and straight into the closet where my grandson curled up. And then what, Owen? Ava asked when the boy fell silent, the only sound the harsh scratch of his pencil on paper. I heard a chair push, something fall. Daddy said, calm down, Melanie. Mommy screamed. And then he stopped, his eyes widening, staring at his own drawing, the pencil turning gray as he shaded a large dark patch in the living room. There was a bang, like somebody hit their head. Then there wasn't Daddy's voice anymore. The last words barely sound at all, just broken air. The room suddenly felt smaller, the heart monitor's steady beeping in the corner, fading beneath the single thing left in my mind. The silence Owen had just described, the silence after the bang. Ava placed her hand lightly on the paper. What did you do after that? Owen looked toward the toy car on his pillow, reaching out to touch it as if grounding himself. I waited for Daddy to call. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3, 2. A lot. I got hungry. I drank all the juice boxes in the closet. When they were gone, I crawled to the bathroom, drank from the sink. At night, I heard cars outside and thought Mommy had come back. But nobody called me. I was scared. If I came out and Daddy wasn't there, Mommy would be mad, so I stayed in the closet, like Daddy said. I had to look away again. They say nothing is crueler than a father's warning meant to protect a child, turning into the very cage that traps him in the dark. 20 minutes later, after Ava gently steered the conversation toward lighter things, drawing cars and soccer fields, 2 Rockingham County officers appeared at the door, knocking softly as if afraid to startle the boy. The taller one introduced himself as Detective Harris, the shorter as his partner. They let Owen rest and asked me into the hallway. We sat on a plastic bench overlooking the parking lot, where the snow had melted into dirty streaks. Mr. Granger, we need you to tell us a bit more about your son and your former daughter-in-law, Harris said, opening a notebook, eyes fixed on me. I recounted everything, my voice flat, like reading a page I wished had never been written. Nathan and Melanie married 10 years ago, separated 3 months back after endless fights about money. Melanie had invested in crypto and lost a large sum, about $37,000. Nathan had twice helped pay her credit card debt and negotiated with her landlord so she wouldn't be evicted. The last time he'd told me, I can't keep being the ATM, Dad. I have to save money for Owen's future. I also mentioned the man I'd only heard about in passing, a so-called investment advisor Melanie often spoke of, with a strangely hopeful tone. Harris scribbled quickly, his pen sliding across the page like a thin blade. When I fell silent, he looked up, studying me for a long moment as if weighing his words. Finally, he closed the notebook, slipped the pen into his pocket, and said a sentence that made the rest of the world tilt beneath my feet. Mr. Elliot, with what Owen described and with Melanie's debt history, I'm afraid we're no longer talking about a missing person case. That was enough to make my whole body turn cold. 37,000 crypto. And I remember the time Nathan mentioned over the phone that Melanie, his ex-wife, was trying to invest in something with a new guy, and her account had vanished by an amount nearly equal to my entire year's salary when I was still teaching. And I'd told him then, don't be foolish enough to pay all that for her. Debt from chasing easy profit has to be carried by the one who chased it. And Nathan only laughed and said, I'm just trying to keep Owen from hearing the fights, Dad. But now those fights had burst past the walls of his house and straight into the closet where my grandson lay curled up. Then what, Owen? Ava asked when the boy fell silent, only the harsh scrape of his pencil on paper left. I heard a chair push, something fall. Daddy said, calm down, Melanie. Mommy screamed, and then he stopped, eyes wide, staring at the drawing he had made, the pencil shifting to gray as he shaded a dark mass in the center of the living room. There was a thud, like someone hit their head, and then there wasn't Daddy's voice anymore, the last line barely a breath. The room felt smaller, the heart monitor beeping steadily in the corner, while in my mind there was only the silence Owen had described, the silence after the thud. Ava set her hand gently on the paper. What did you do after that? Owen turned toward the toy car on his pillow, touching it as if to steady himself. I waited for Daddy to call. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3, 2. A lot. I got hungry. I drank all the juice boxes in the closet. When they were gone, I crawled to the bathroom, drank from the sink. At night, I heard cars outside. I thought Mommy had come back. But nobody called me. I was scared. If I came out and Daddy wasn't there, Mommy would be mad, so I stayed in the closet, like Daddy said. I had to look away again. They say nothing is crueler than a father's warning, meant to protect his child, becoming the very cage that traps him in the dark. 20 minutes later, once Ava gently shifted the talk toward lighter things, drawing cars and soccer fields, 2 Rockingham County officers appeared at the door, knocking softly as if afraid to startle the boy. The taller one introduced himself as Detective Harris, the shorter as his partner, and they let Owen rest and asked me out into the hallway. We sat on a plastic bench looking toward the parking lot, where the snow had melted into streaks of dirty water. Mr. Granger, we need you to give us a bit more information about your son and your former daughter-in-law, Harris said, opening a notebook, his eyes fixed on me. I told everything, my voice even as though reading aloud a page I never wanted to open. Nathan and Melanie married 10 years ago, separated 3 months back after endless fights about money. Melanie had invested in crypto and lost a large sum, about $37,000. Nathan had twice helped pay her credit card debt and negotiated with her landlord so she wouldn't be evicted. The last time, he told me, I can't keep being the ATM dad. I have to save money for Owen's future. I also mentioned the man I'd only heard of in passing, a so-called investment advisor, Melanie kept mentioning with an oddly hopeful tone. Harris wrote quickly, his pen moving across the page like a thin blade, and when I stopped, he looked up, studying me for a long moment as if choosing his words. Finally, he closed the notebook, put the pen away, and said a sentence that made the rest of the world slide out from under my feet. Mr. Elliot, with what Owen described and with Melanie's debt history, I'm afraid we're not talking about a missing person case anymore. That afternoon, once Owen was stabilized and moved to a monitoring room, Detective Harris told me to return to Dover with the forensics team. I didn't want to leave the hospital, but he said one thing that forced me to stand. If we want to find out what happened to Nathan, we have to start now. The road from Boston to Dover felt longer than it ever had, headlights smeared over rain-wet asphalt, streaks of light as blurred as my mind, chaotic, frightened, clinging to the thin hope that Nathan was somewhere unconscious, but alive. As we turned onto Nathan's street, police cars were already lined up, red and blue lights reflecting against the dark windows of the neighbors' houses. making the whole block seem to breathe fast. Nathan's door was sealed with yellow tape. A forensic tech in a white protective suit stepped out and nodded at Harris, a signal that everything was ready. I walked in behind them. The house still held the same damp scent from the morning. Wet carpet, cold pine wood, and the heavy smell of something that had happened but had not yet been named. A technician pulled a pale blue spray bottle from his kit, shook it gently, and misted the living room floor. Luminol, the chemical that reveals blood even after it's been scrubbed down to the bone. For a few seconds the room held its breath. Then blue light began blooming across the floor. Faint spots growing, spreading, thin streaks, long arcs, small pooled dots like exclamation marks in a bloody sentence. Each glowing blot rose before my eyes like a memory fragment brought back, and by the time they connected into a trail stretching from the coffee table down toward the floor, I could barely stay upright. Harris stood beside me, his voice low and weighted. This wasn't someone falling lightly. This is blood spatter, impact force. I swallowed hard. Clearly Nathan had fought, had fallen, and had bled. Right here. Another tech called out, "We've got a handprint on the back door, not fully wiped." Harris went over, crouched to look, then turned to me with a gaze that allowed no comfortable hope. "We'll compare it to everyone in Melanie's circle." 20 minutes later, the identification system returned a preliminary result. The print wasn't Nathan's, wasn't Melanie's, but belonged to a man, Caleb Dawson. The name made my chest tighten. I remembered Nathan mentioning Melanie knowing a man who helped her recover crypto losses. I hadn't thought much of it. Now everything was forming a monstrous shape. We kept searching. In Nathan's small office, where he reviewed construction plans, papers were scattered everywhere, yet nothing was stolen. No electronics missing, no safe forced open. "This isn't a random break-in," one tech said. "This is someone who came for something specific," Harris added. I stared at the scattered documents, tax forms, insurance files, a copy of the divorce agreement, each one seeming to scream a truth I'd ignored too long. At the foot of the stairs, a young investigator bent down and picked up a long black hair. With a hint of blue under the flashlight, he lifted it into a sample bag with tweezers. "Dye! Cheap kind." I knew immediately whose it was. Melanie. When she lived with Nathan, she changed hair color as often as moods, but she always liked that blue-black shade because it looked more edgy. Harris sighed and tossed his gloves into the biohazard bin. Melanie used to be blonde when she was a receptionist, but she's been black-haired for the last 3 months, right? I think so. She was here, with the man. The room felt smaller, colder, tightening around my lungs. Out in the backyard, another forensic tech called, "Detective!" Hughes's house camera caught the entry lane. Harris opened a laptop, inserted the memory card. The screen showed grainy footage in the rainy night. A silver sedan pulling up at 11:14 Sunday night, headlights shutting off the moment it stopped in front of Nathan's house. No face clear enough to identify, but I recognized the silhouette of the woman holding the umbrella, the familiar stride of Melanie when she was angry. "Zoom the plate," Harris said. The computer processed, enlarging each pixel, not the full sequence, but enough to read 6 characters. "Partial plate, that's enough. Sending it to DMV for a match." I stared at the laptop screen, a cold shiver running down my spine. 6 characters, but they cut through every fragile hope that this was all some strange misunderstanding. Harris closed the laptop and looked straight at me, his eyes no longer those of an investigator keeping distance, but of someone preparing to deliver bad news to a family. "Elliot," he said slowly, each word heavy as lead, "your son was attacked." I clutched the edge of the table, and for the first time since all of this began, I had to admit the truth my heart had been refusing to face. What happened to Nathan wasn't a disappearance anymore. It was a crime, enough to make my entire body turn cold. 37,000 crypto, I remembered the time Nathan mentioned that Melanie, his ex-wife, had been trying to invest in something with a new guy, and her account had evaporated by an amount nearly equal to my whole year's salary when I was still teaching, and I'd told him then, "Don't be foolish enough to pay everything for her. Debt from chasing quick profit has to be carried by the one who chased it." And Nathan just laughed and said, "I'm only helping so Owen doesn't have to hear the fights, Dad." Yet now those fights had burst past his walls and straight into the closet where my grandson curled up. "And then what, Owen?" Ava asked when she saw the boy go silent, only the hard scraping of the pencil left. I heard a chair push, something fall. Daddy said, "Calm down, Melanie." Mommy screamed. And then he stopped, eyes widening, staring at his own drawing, the pencil turning gray as he shaded a dark patch in the middle of the living room. There was a thud, like someone hitting their head, and then Daddy's voice was gone. The last sentence barely a breath. The room tightened, and the heart monitor's steady beeps faded against the one thing in my mind, the silence Owen had described after the thud. Ava placed her hand lightly on the paper. "What did you do next?" Owen looked at the toy car on the pillow, reached out as if to steady himself. "I waited for Daddy to call. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3, 2, a lot. I was hungry. I drank all the juice boxes in the closet. When they were gone, I crawled to the bathroom, drank from the sink. At night, I heard cars outside. I thought Mommy had come back, but nobody called me. I was scared. If I came out and Daddy wasn't there, Mommy would be mad. So I stayed in the closet, like Daddy said. I had to turn away again. People say nothing is crueler than a father's warning meant to protect a child, turning into the very cage that traps him in darkness. 20 minutes later, when Ava gently shifted the talk to lighter things, drawing cars and soccer fields, 2 Rockingham County officers appeared, knocking softly as though afraid to startle the boy. The taller introduced himself as Detective Harris, the shorter as his partner, and they let Owen rest and asked me out to the hallway. We sat on a plastic bench facing the lot where snow had melted into dirty streaks. "Mr. Granger, we need some more information about your son and your former daughter-in-law," Harris said, notebook open, eyes fixed on me. I spoke in a steady tone like reading from a page I never wanted to open. "Nathan and Melanie married 10 years ago, separated 3 months ago after long fights about money. Melanie invested in crypto and lost a large sum, about $37,000. Nathan had twice helped pay her credit card debt and negotiated with her landlord so she wouldn't be evicted. The last time he told me, 'I can't keep being the ATM, Dad. I need to save for Owen's future.' I also mentioned the man I'd only heard of once, a so-called investment advisor Melanie talked about with a strange hope. Harris wrote fast, his pen slicing the page like a thin blade. When I fell silent, he shut the notebook and said, 'Mr. Elliot, with what Owen said and with Melanie's debt history, we're no longer talking about a missing person case.' That afternoon, when Owen had stabilized and been moved to observation, Harris told me to return to Dover with the forensic team. I didn't want to leave the hospital, but he said, 'If we want to find out what happened to Nathan, we have to begin now.' And the road from Boston to Dover felt longer than ever, headlights smearing over rain-wet asphalt like my own thoughts, blurred, frightened, and clinging to the hope that Nathan was somewhere unconscious, but alive. When we turned onto his street, police cars lined the block, red and blue lights shivering across the dark windows of neighboring houses. Nathan's door was sealed with yellow tape, and a forensic tech in a white suit nodded to Harris. Everything ready. I followed them in. The house still held that damp, abandoned smell. Wet carpet, cold pine, and the heavy stink of something that had happened but hadn't yet been named. A tech shook a pale blue bottle and sprayed it across the living room floor. Luminol, the chemical that reveals blood even after the strongest scrubbing. The room held its breath, then blue light blossomed. spots and streaks and arcs like the punctuation of a violent story. By the time the dots connected into a line from the coffee table to the floor, I could barely stand, Harris said, his voice heavy. This wasn't someone falling. This is blood spatter, impact force. And I swallowed hard, realizing Nathan had fought, fallen, and bled right here. Another tech shouted, "Handprint on the back door, partially wiped." And when Harris checked it, he turned to me with a look that allowed no mistaken hope. "We'll compare it to everyone in Melanie's records." 20 minutes later, the preliminary match came. Not Nathan's, not Melanie's, but a man's, Caleb Dawson. The name tightened something in my chest. I remembered Nathan mentioning Melanie knew a man helping her recover crypto losses. I hadn't thought twice. Now the pieces formed a dark shape. We searched further. Nathan's small office cluttered with papers, but nothing stolen. No electronics, no safe broken. "Not a burglary," a tech said. "Someone looking for something specific," Harris added. I stared at the scattered documents. Tax papers, insurance forms, a copy of the divorce agreement, each sheet screaming a truth I'd ignored. Near the stairs, a young investigator found a long black hair with a blue sheen. "Cheap dye," he said, dropping it into a bag. I knew immediately whose it was. Melanie, who had changed hair colors often but loved that blue-black shade. Harris sighed, tossed his gloves, and said, "She was blonde when she worked reception, but she switched to black 3 months ago, right?" I think so. She was here, with the man." The room tightened around me. Outside, another tech called, "Detective! Hughes's camera shows the entry lane." Harris opened a laptop and video appeared. A silver sedan pulling up at 11:14 on Sunday night. Headlights shut off immediately. No clear faces, but the silhouette with the umbrella, Melanie's angry stride, unmistakable. "Zoom the plate," Harris said. The computer enlarged it. 6 characters. "Partial plate. Enough. Sending to DMV." And I stared at the screen, a cold stripe down my spine. 6 characters cutting through the last bits of hope. Harris closed the laptop and looked straight at me. "We have a match. The plate belongs to someone in Boston. Name..." He checked his phone and read each word clearly. "Caleb Dawson." My heart dropped. Caleb, the crypto expert Melanie had boasted about, the man who dragged her into fast-profit fantasies, and the man I hadn't paid enough attention to. I remembered Melanie's voice. "He's helping me get back my crypto. He knows a lot. He's really good." And now all the pieces formed the shape of something darker than any fear I had imagined. Harris pocketed his phone and said, his voice heavy as nails being driven in, "Elliot, we need to talk about Caleb Dawson and about Melanie." And the room seemed to lose all its air, and I knew deep inside that what waited ahead would be far worse than anything Owen had said. The financial information on Nathan came back to the investigation team quickly, mostly because he was a civil engineer, with clean, orderly insurance files, taxes, and employment contracts. Detective Harris brought me into a small briefing room at the Dover police station, where a whiteboard had already been filled with marker notes, timelines, involved individuals, call logs, bank transactions, and printed photos from the scene. At the center of the board, 4 bold words: "Insurance, $600,000. Why is this here?" I asked, though I already knew the answer wouldn't be easy to hear. Harris tapped the thick folder in front of me. "Nathan's life insurance. He set it up when Owen was born. Back then, he was still happy with Melanie, and he made her the primary beneficiary." My chest tightened. Nathan had once told me, "Dad, it's just a precaution for Owen. If anything happens to me, Melanie will take care of the boy." He trusted his wife, trusted her enough to sign the paper that was now hanging like a hook over his life. "Why didn't Nathan change the beneficiary after the divorce?" I asked, my voice raw. Harris exhaled. "A lot of people don't think of it, especially after a bitter split. He was working construction, juggling deadlines, worrying about Owen, but Melanie remembered very well. He slid a second folder toward me. This is the rest of the motive. And it's bad. I opened it. The world dimmed. Page 1. Crypto loss statement, showing Melanie Brooks had lost $37,400 in 8 weeks. Page 2. Credit card overdue, more than $12,000 owed, 3 billing cycles late. Page 3. Vehicle repossession warning, from her financing company, with a red stamp, final notice. And beneath it, a single line that froze my whole body. Contact listed, Caleb Dawson, advisor. Harris looked at me, eyes firm but not cruel. Caleb is the one who pulled Melanie into crypto, and he's also the one who told her there was only one way to reset her life. My throat locked. What did you just say? Exact wording from Caleb's message to Melanie, pulled from her iCloud backup. There's only one way to reset everything, Mel. You know it. The room spun. I had to grip the edge of the table. Elliot, Harris continued, we have evidence they tracked Nathan's routines for weeks. His end-of-shift times, his habit of turning the lights on before entering the house, when Owen slept at which home. Even the way Nathan sometimes forgot to lock the back door after bringing things in. I shut my eyes. All those little details Nathan mentioned casually in our Tuesday calls. Harmless stories, ordinary things, things he thought no one would ever use, but someone had listened and used them. Melanie knew Nathan still had her as beneficiary since 2014, Harris said. She did the math, and Caleb needed quick money to get out of the crypto hole. A hot, sharp pain speared through my chest. Nathan had been deceived, Owen abandoned, and I, the one who had warned Melanie, who told Nathan not to get involved in her investments, had not intervened hard enough. Pain climbed my neck and shoulders, but I stood straighter, knowing what I had heard was just the beginning of the nightmare. The briefing room door burst open. A young officer came in with a tablet, speaking quickly. Detective, we got a hit. The plate has pinged on Mass Pike heading toward Boston. Mass Pike, the highway cutting across the state. Boston, the place Caleb lived, where Melanie had friends, old jobs, and countless places to hide. Harris turned to me, his face tightening. Elliot, they're on the move, and they know we're tracking them. I didn't answer. A cold current climbed from my spine to my scalp. Melanie was running, Caleb was running, and my son, no one knew where he was, alive or dead, conscious or gone. I stared at the folder on the table, the number $600,000, like a burned, black scar across the page. All because of money. Money Nathan once called a precaution, and Melanie called an escape route. And now it had become the spark that set fire to my whole family. The location pings from the silver sedan, flashing steadily along Interstate 95 toward Boston, sent the whole team moving like alive, wire hitting water. And I sat in the passenger seat of Detective Harris's car, my hands clasped so tight the knuckles turned white, while the maps on the dashboard laptop kept updating the path of that license plate, turning off exit 32, then 28, then cutting into Somerville, finally stopping at an old apartment block on Lowell Street. We're here, Harris said, his polite tone edged with the alert hardness detectives develop over years in the field. The 4-story building was worn down, its red brick faded, hallways stained with damp patches, and outside, people stood on balconies watching as 4 police cruisers lined the curb, a few phones already up and recording. Boston was a place where cameras appeared faster than rain. I stood just behind the officers, but it felt like I was the one being pushed under all those judging eyes. The door of Unit 3B was hit 3 times. Boston police, open up. No answer. Harris nodded to the breach team. One heavy kick. The lock tore free, the door slammed against the wall, and a rush of damp air, cigarette smoke, and a faint metallic tang hit my face. The living room was a mess. Empty beer cans, fast food bags, a scorched outlet, and on the table, papers everywhere. The first thing my eyes caught was a printed file with Nathan's name across the top, and beneath it, in large type, life insurance, $600,000. Beneficiary, Melanie Brooks. And I gripped the door frame to keep from collapsing. That's motive, clear as day, an officer muttered. In the corner on the sofa lay a dark gray jacket thrown carelessly aside, and a forensic tech lifted it into the flashlight beam. Dark stains, washed but not fully removed. Blood. My heart stumbled. Bag it, Harris ordered. From the bedroom, where the door hung half open, a shout rose. Detective, you're going to want to see this. I followed before I could think, and though I wasn't supposed to step farther in, Harris lifted a hand. Let him see. On the floor by the bed, next to an open duffel bag, was a small toy. A red mini police car. I recognized it immediately. It was the one Owen always carried when he ran outside. The one Nathan teased him about. He treats it like a lucky charm, Dad. And now, it was here, in the filthy room of the man who had dragged my son into this nightmare for money. I had to hold the doorframe again to steady myself. Footsteps thundered in the hall. A shout, He's running down the stairs! Harris and I rushed out. At the far end of the corridor, a man in a black hoodie, hair wild, face pale, was shoving at the emergency exit door, but officers were already blocking the stairs below. Caleb Dawson, don't move! He turned. His eyes jerked wide when he saw me. I knew him instantly, the man standing beside Melanie in the photo Nathan sent me from last year's parent-teacher night. They hadn't said a word to each other then, just stood a little too close. I had felt something off, but I ignored it, and now it was far too late. Cold cuffs snapped around Caleb's wrists, metal clacking sharply before the patrol car door slammed shut. Neighbors on balconies filmed, live-streamed. A woman even shouted, Another crypto scammer, huh? Burn in jail. Caleb bowed his head, hair covering most of his face, but the wash of police lights still let me see his eyes. Red, not from remorse but from panic. As they pushed him into the cruiser, he turned suddenly toward me. A strange moment. Two people in the same frame, but from two different worlds. He opened his mouth, his voice shaking as if the words were forcing themselves past fear and guilt, both. I think your son is still alive. All sound vanished. Even the live streamers froze. The officers on the stairs stopped moving. The whole world shrank to just 7 words. Your son is still alive. My chest clenched. Nathan, alive. If what he said was true, then it meant Nathan was somewhere, wounded, maybe dying, and every second passing was a second that could steal his chance to survive. Harris spun toward Caleb, his voice sharp as a blade. Caleb, tell us now, where is he? But Caleb only shook his head, his lips trembling. I can't. She'll kill me. The cruiser door slammed, and I understood. My time was running out. Caleb was dragged out of the patrol car and pinned against the wall of the Boston PD headquarters. And under the pressure of Harris and the investigation team, he had nothing left to hold on to. Cold sweat dripping down his collar as he broke into sobs, his voice stuttering like he was vomiting out his own guilt. Melanie thought he was dead. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to keep doing it, but she had the knife. The interrogation room was as silent as an abandoned chapel, and I stood behind the one-way glass, my palms pressed together so hard the knuckles had turned bone white. Caleb, Detective Harris growled, where is Nathan? He swallowed hard, shoulders shaking as though they were about to snap. Revere, storage, Unit 12B. There's a freezer. She said the body had to stay there. The air around me thickened, as if the whole room had been drained of oxygen. Revere, a run-down coastal district, full of old storage units where people kept anything from leftover furniture to things they never want found. 30 minutes later, the convoy tore through wet city streets, sirens echoing off the gray sky, the wind cold enough to cut my face like blades. Unit 12B stood apart, the white wall stained with rust near the base, the steel door thick and heavy like a war-era bunker. A forensic tech slid the warehouse owner's key into the lock, his hand trembling not from the cold, but because everyone knew what waited beyond that door. The door swung open. A cloud of white cold burst out like smoke and hit my face, numbing my skin. Inside, a body lay motionless on the metal floor, dusted with a thin layer of frozen mist. Nathan! I couldn't breathe. Harris rushed in first. "Clear! EMT's in!" I followed on instinct, my eyes locked on my son's curled, unmoving form. Nathan didn't stir, didn't respond when they lifted his head. But then a nurse shouted, "There's a pulse! Faint!" It felt like someone hurled me back into my own body after I'd already left it behind. I lunged forward, dropping to my knees beside the stretcher as they lifted him. His face was chalk white, his lips turning blue from the cold, but his chest struggled to rise with whatever fragile strength he had left. "Move! Get him out!" I clung to the side of the stretcher as they rushed him out of the icy unit, through the freezing corridor, across the wind-bitten lot, into the ambulance. Massachusetts General Hospital. ICU met us in a blaze of white lights, bright enough to shatter the night sky. I don't remember the elevator or how many steps I took. I remember only Nathan's ice-cold hand in mine. A doctor with rain-spotted scrubs stepped out after nearly 40 minutes of emergency treatment, and the look on his face knotted my stomach. "Mr. Elliot?" I nodded, my voice cracking when I answered, "Yes." He exhaled softly, the kind of breath belonging to someone who has seen too much pain. "Your son has a severe traumatic brain injury, massive blood loss, and prolonged hypothermia. We're managing brain swelling, he's on a ventilator, and we're giving continuous warming and transfusion support." I tried to stand straight, but my legs wouldn't obey. "Doctor, will he wake up?" He looked at me for a long time, not avoiding, not promising. "Right now we can't say. It could be tomorrow, it could be weeks, it could be longer. Nathan is fighting, but he paused, then said quietly, "We have to wait." I don't know if I collapsed or someone caught me. I remember only the ICU doors closing, sealing me off from the sun I raised with everything I had. The hallway was empty except for me and the faint rhythm of the ventilator behind the glass. I wiped my face, stood, slowly, and asked the only question I still had strength for. "And Melanie?" Detective Harris appeared behind me, his voice sharp as a cold blade. "She's gone. Not in Boston, not at home, not at Caleb's. We think she's running." And the whole world narrowed once again into silence. Melanie vanished from Boston like a ghost, but every ghost leaves a trace, and this time the trace wasn't blood or footprints. It was cash. Detective Harris called me at 6 in the morning. "Mr. Elliot, she just withdrew $680 from an ATM in Cambridge. We got her on camera." "A clear shot of her face?" I asked. "Not her real face? She changed her hair 3 times, blonde, black, blonde, using a new name, Laura Hansen." A cold line ran down my spine. The investigation team immediately focused on her movements. On camera, Melanie walking fast, clutching a backpack, hat pulled low, eyes darting like a cornered animal looking for a way out. Then a new location ping. South Station. I went with Harris. South Station in the morning was chaos louder than a broken hive. People dragging suitcases, train wheels rattling, announcements blaring, the smell of hot coffee in the air. But when we entered, everything slowed, like a reel pulled too tight. That morning, NBC Boston was broadcasting across the station. "Suspect mother on the run. 9-year-old boy survived 6 days alone." Melanie's ATM photo filled the giant screen above the Starbucks counter. When she walked past it, a woman lifting her latte looked up, looked from the screen to Melanie, then screamed, "Oh my God, that's her! That's the woman who left her kid to die." 10 phones lifted, then 20, then dozens. Melanie stood in the middle of the concourse, just a few steps from the Greyhound gate. In her hand, a ticket to Montreal, Seat G12, departing in 6 minutes. She turned, her eyes meeting mine, and for an instant, the entire station fell into a vacuum of absolute silence. An officer stepped forward, but Melanie spun and ran, shoving through the crowd. A passenger grabbed her backpack, yanking her back. "Boston police! Stop!" Harris shouted. Melanie clawed a cop's arm, stomped another's foot, then slipped on the stone floor in panic. 2 officers lunged, one pinning her shoulders, the other wrenching her wrist behind her back. Melanie screamed until her voice broke, thrashing, her legs kicking against the floor like someone drowning in her own terror. And then, click, the 2 cuffs locked, the metallic snap slicing through the air like the lid of a coffin sealing shut. The crowd erupted, shouting, filming, live streaming, flashes strobing across her pale face. Then she shrieked, "Elliot, you don't understand. He wasn't worth keeping alive. Everything was supposed to be easy. He wasn't supposed to survive." The scream cut the air like a blade. The station exploded. People yelling, recording, shouting into their streams. She admitted it, on camera. Melanie writhed, but only for a few seconds. The cuffs clicked again, echoing through the concourse like a final nail. She was dragged away, her tangled blonde hair half covering her stunned face. But her eyes still slashed toward me, not with regret, but with the bitter venom of someone who had gambled her whole life on greed and watched it burn to ash beneath her feet. I stood 3 meters from her, but between us lay an entire family torn apart. Harris placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over now, Elliot." I didn't answer. I just watched the woman who once called me Dad, who once sat at my family's table, now being dragged away under shouts and flashing lights. Melanie was arrested at South Station, and in front of hundreds of people, she screamed the confession that froze the entire terminal. "He wasn't supposed to survive." The Suffolk County courtroom that morning was so crowded, the hallway felt solid. People spilled down the stone steps outside. Neighbors from Dover, Nathan's co-workers, former colleagues of mine from Portsmouth High, students who once listened to me lecture about ethics and history, all standing silently as I walked into the courtroom. They weren't there out of curiosity. They were there to witness justice. Courtroom 4A was packed like a lecture hall on the first day of school. Cameras from CBS Boston, WCVB, NECN were all present. When officers brought Melanie in, a ripple of whispers rose like a wave. Her hair was pale blonde, her face drained, her eyes red from sleeplessness, but no one in that room looked at her as a mother anymore. Caleb was brought in after. He kept his head down, hands trembling, the chain of his cuffs glinting under the ceiling lights. Judge Rivera took his seat, and the crack of the gavel dropped every sound to the floor. The trial began with testimony from investigators, then the emergency physician, then the forensic specialist. Every statement landed like a hammer strike against the false wall Melanie had tried to build. But the moment that froze the entire courtroom was when Owen was called. The boy wore a white dress shirt, his small hand clinging tightly to mine as we walked to the witness stand. He was only 9. Yet his eyes carried the kind of scar I knew he would bear for life. The prosecutor asked gently, "Can you tell the jury what you remember from that night?" Owen bit his lip, stared at his little shoes, then looked up and asked the question that made the whole room stop breathing. "Mom, why did you leave Dad lying there so long?" The question fell like a stone hurled into a still lake, cold, heavy, sending ripples through every gaze. The courtroom went instantly silent. No camera clicks, no whispers, not even a heavy breath. Melanie sat at the defense table, her face bleaching white as though every drop of blood had drained from it. The prosecutor thanked Owen and excused him. He ran back to me and wrapped his arms tight around my waist. I placed my hand on his back, a small back, but steady and resolute like winter pine. Then it was Caleb's turn. He stood, raised his face for the first time, his voice shaking but each word clear. "I plead guilty." The courtroom rustled. I was involved. But Melanie, she planned everything. She wanted the insurance money. She pushed Nathan. She made me move the body. He turned toward Melanie. You said if Nathan died, we'd both get a share. Melanie shot to her feet, slammed the table, and screamed, I was drowning in debt. He owed me his life, owed me everything I built for him. The cameras swung directly toward her mascara-smeared face, recording every twitch at the corner of her mouth. The gallery erupted in whispers. Disgusting. She left the kid in a closet. No humanity left. Judge Rivera had to strike the gavel twice to restore order. That afternoon, the jury returned after 3 hours of deliberation. We find the defendant, Melanie Brooks, guilty on all counts. Melanie collapsed into her seat, too drained even to scream. The judge read the sentence. Melanie Brooks, 35 to 45 years in state prison. Then he turned to Caleb Dawson, 18 to 25 years. The entire courtroom exhaled, not in relief, but in release. Melanie looked at me as she was led away. No more madness, no more defiance, only emptiness, the emptiness of someone who had burned her own conscience to ash. I held Owen's hand as we left the courtroom. The Boston afternoon sun, shining through the tall windows, fell across the two of us like a reminder that justice may come late, but it never fades. On a late afternoon, when the sea breeze carried a faint salt smell, the same smell that used to make Nathan dash onto the porch whenever he heard the waves hitting the pilings, Owen came home with me to Portsmouth. My small house had always been quiet, the quiet of an old man used to reading books, brewing tea, and listening to morning radio, but now it held the sound of a child's footsteps again. I set up a small bed in the room beside mine. Owen laid out his superhero blanket and lined up 3 toy cars neatly on the bedside table. He was quieter than any child his age should be, and sometimes he stared far away like a boy carved out of fog. But every time I touched his shoulder, he leaned into me, as if the only safety left in the world lived in the act of resting against an old man's chest. I was learning how to be a father again, but this time I was learning through pain and gratitude at the same time. Early mornings making pancakes, afternoons reading stories, evenings checking the heater, and every night I stood a long time watching him sleep, afraid that if I stepped out even for a moment, the darkness might take him again. But hope, the fragile, stubborn kind, lived on the 7th floor of the ICU at Massachusetts General Hospital, where Nathan lay among tubes and the steady rhythm of a ventilator that sounded like a sad song with no end. Nathan had not woken up, but his body had begun to respond. A twitch of a finger, a faint pull of a leg muscle, movements so small anyone else might miss them, but to me they were miracles. Each day I sat beside him and opened the old history book Nathan used to love hearing me read when he was little. The American Soul, Stories That Built a Nation. The pages were worn, their edges yellowed with years. I used to read the chapter, Washington in the Winter at Valley Forge, to Nathan when he was 8. That day he asked me, Dad, does being that cold hurt? I remember answering, It hurts, but you endure it for something bigger than yourself. Now, reading that same passage, my voice broke at the line, The survivor is not the strongest, but the one who refuses to give up hope. Nathan's fingers stirred. I held his hand, and in that moment, the whole long winter seemed to thaw. That evening, while Owen and I sat by the window, the streetlight casting our shadows long across the wall, the boy looked up and asked, Grandpa, can Dad hear us? I placed my hand on his hair, smoothing it the way I once smoothed Nathan's, after he brought home a failing math test in 6th grade. Yes, buddy, and your dad knows you survived. You did something even grown-ups couldn't do. Owen leaned his head on my shoulder. Outside, snow began to fall, the first flakes of the season, light as breath, still as a whispered prayer. I looked toward the dim sky, and in my heart I spoke the words I hadn't dared say aloud. Nathan, come back home. Your family is still waiting. My son, you still have a way back. More than a year had passed since the scream that shattered South Station and the night Nathan was pulled out of the Revere cold storage unit. A year that felt like a winter without a calendar. But at last, New England slipped into late fall, the season when light turns softer, golden, like a hand on the shoulder of someone who has endured enough. Owen had fewer nightmares now. He no longer jerked awake at the sound of rain, no longer feared closet doors. He laughed more, ran faster, and some days he even biked past me on the coastal road in Portsmouth. And me, I stood steadier, partly because of responsibility, partly because of love, but mostly because I no longer stood alone. But the brightest moment came on a late autumn afternoon, when yellow leaves fell onto the hospital awning like pieces of time drifting into the earth. Owen and I were sitting in the ICU, the last light of day angling through the window, laying a thin band of brightness across Nathan's bed, so faint I thought it was just my heart's wish painting it there. Owen whispered, "Grandpa, I think Dad would like the weather today." I opened my mouth to answer when Nathan's finger moved, stronger than ever before. I shot to my feet. Owen grabbed my shirt, and then Nathan's eyes opened. Not for long, only a few seconds. But to me, it was a lifetime. The first 2 seconds, empty. The third, his pupils tightened against the light. The fourth, his eyelid fluttered, as if he were trying to pull me into focus. I couldn't hold myself together. I started crying, the kind of cry with no sound, just the trembling of an old prayer. Nathan's hand lay in mine, weak but warm, alive but fragile as a candle in the wind. When the doctor rushed in, I dropped into the chair, my cheeks still wet. Nathan closed his eyes again, falling into the deep sleep of someone just returned from the edge between two worlds. But I knew. Owen knew. We both knew. He was coming back, slowly, but surely. As I bent to pick up the old history book that had slipped from the stack beside the bed, a loose page slid out and drifted to the floor. I picked it up. It was Nathan's handwriting from when he was around 16, the slanted, slightly heavy strokes written with the fountain pen I'd given him on his first day of high school. Family first, always. I pressed the page to my chest, my hand shaking, not from age, but because those words returned at the moment I needed them most. I looked at Owen, the boy sitting beside me, watching as if waiting for a new promise. I placed my hand on his back, looked out through the tall window at the last light of the New England autumn, and said quietly, solid as the granite of this region, I couldn't save my son from the dark, but God gave me the chance to save my grandson from it. Owen leaned into me, and for the first time in many months, I felt my heart warm, like the little wooden house at Christmas when Nathan was young. The dark had come, but the light of late autumn stayed with us. And so one of the darkest chapters of my life, and Owen's, closed at last, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to remind us that light can still find its way through the deepest cracks. If this story made your heart pause even for a moment, if it reminded you of someone you loved, lost, or tried to protect, leave me a... So I know that somewhere out there, someone is still listening to the tale of an old man from New England. And if you want to walk with me through the stories ahead, stories of family, justice, forgiveness, and the things only the heart can hear, hit subscribe and tell me which city you're listening from. Your presence is what gives these stories meaning. Thank you for staying with me to the end.